He was the most powerful emperor the world had ever seen. But his final meal changed everything. Was it just an ordinary dinner, or a carefully planned act of murder? The cup he drank from, and the plate he left behind, still haunt history with unanswered questions. Watch until the very end to uncover the shocking truth. And if you love hidden secrets of history, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. The story of the last meal of history's most powerful emperor does not begin with food. It begins with the weight of years, the heavy burden of power, and the strange reality that even the mightiest rulers who command armies, lands, and treasures must face the same end as the poorest beggar. What makes the last meal of an emperor so fascinating is not just what he ate, but what it meant. The final moments of a man who once commanded nations can reveal more about his life, his fears, his regrets, and his legacy than the countless battles he fought or the palaces he built. In those quiet moments before death, stripped of titles and surrounded not by adoring crowds, but by silence, an emperor becomes simply human. Imagine a great ruler, sitting alone at a long table, once surrounded by golden chalices, silk drapes, and an army of servants. Now, near the end, his table is smaller, his appetite weaker, and his company few. The meal before him is not a feast to impress foreign ambassadors, not a banquet to celebrate victory, but a simple arrangement of food chosen either for comfort, tradition, or perhaps superstition. And as he takes each bite, it becomes more than nourishment. It becomes memory, symbolism, and farewell. To understand the last meal of this emperor, we must first step into his world. He was not born ordinary. From a young age, destiny wrapped itself around him like an iron chain. His family belonged to nobility, and he was groomed to lead, to conquer, to rule. From childhood, his meals were a lesson in power. While other children might have eaten bread and stew, he tasted exotic spices brought from distant lands, honey poured into golden bowls, roasted meats prepared by the most skilled chefs of the empire. Even at the table, he was reminded of his place above others. Servants bowed as they served, and every plate was a demonstration of his status. But what does food mean to a man who has everything? For him, meals were never only about hunger. They were political displays. To invite a general or minister to his table meant granting favor. To deny someone a seat meant punishment or exclusion. Each feast was a stage, each dish a message, each goblet of wine a silent reminder of his power. But the meal we are about to witness is different. It is not about politics. It is not about power. It is about the end of a journey, that as he grew older, battles became memories and victories turned into dusty records. His body, once strong and unshakable, began to bend with age. Where once he rode horses and led armies, now he walked with assistance. His appetite changed to the rich, heavy foods of his youth no longer comforted him. They weighed on him. He turned instead to simpler meals, often prepared with care by trusted hands. Yet still, he was emperor, and even in simplicity, his food carried meaning. The night before his death, the palace was unusually quiet. The corridors that once echoed with hurried footsteps of advisors and guards now felt empty. Some knew the end was near. Others whispered in secret, already planning what would happen once the great man was gone. In the emperor's chamber, however, the mood was different. He seemed calm, reflective, perhaps even resigned. He asked for a meal, not a banquet, not a lavish feast, but a final supper. The meal consisted of bread, simple yet symbolic, for bread was the food of the people. By asking for it, perhaps he wanted to connect with the masses he once ruled, to remind himself that beneath the crown, he too was a man of flesh and bone. Alongside it was roasted meat, tender and carefully seasoned, not the extravagant peacock or exotic delicacies once served at his table, but a more modest cut, like lamb or chicken, something comforting, something familiar. He sipped wine, not the rarest from his collection but a warm, full-bodied vintage he had long favored, and with it came fruit figs, dates, or grapes. Symbols of life, sweetness, and continuity. But the meal was not only about taste. Each item on his plate carried memories. The bread reminded him of his childhood, when his mother would break it with him and whisper words of destiny. The meat recalled countless banquets where he raised a cup to victory. The wine reminded him of treaties sealed with toasts and friendships gained and lost. The fruit brought back summers of his youth when the world felt endless, and the weight of empire had not yet settled on his shoulders. As he ate, he spoke little. Those around him trusted servants, perhaps a loyal advisor or two watched in silence. They understood the gravity of the moment. This was not simply a meal. This was the closing act of a long reign. The emperor's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the cup, not out of fear but from age. Yet his eyes remained sharp, thoughtful, as though measuring the meaning of every bite. Some say that as he ate, he reflected aloud on his life. He spoke of the people he had conquered, the cities he had built, the betrayals he had endured, and the mistakes he could not undo. Others say he remained silent, keeping his thoughts within, letting the food speak for him. History cannot tell us his exact words, but it preserves the image of an emperor who, in his final hours, did not surround himself with jewels or soldiers, but with the simple act of eating. It is remarkable to think that this man, who once commanded armies and held the fate of nations in his hands, ended his life as all humans do, with a last meal, a last drink, a last moment of reflection. That night, after finishing, he placed his cup down slowly, as though closing a chapter. He leaned back, weary yet composed, and allowed himself to rest. The palace grew quieter still. Outside, the night continued, unaware that within those walls, the life of a legend was nearing its end. What makes his last meal so powerful is not the food itself, but what it represents. It reminds us that even the strongest are not immortal, that power cannot delay the inevitable, that no crown can shield a man from the passage of time. His last meal was both a farewell and a reminder, a final act of humanity, from a man remembered as more than human. And yet, whispers remain. Some say the meal was poisoned, not chosen. That enemies within the court saw his weakness and took their chance. Others claim that he knew of the danger but accepted it, preferring to leave the world on his own terms rather than fade into weakness. Historians debate these details endlessly, but the truth may never be fully known. What matters is that the image of the emperor at his table, breaking bread for the last time, remains etched in history. The story of his last meal carries forward to us today, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a lesson. Power fades, wealth vanishes, empires crumble. But the human experience, the act of eating, remembering, reflecting, remains eternal. Whether emperor or commoner, the last meal is always more than food. It is closure, it is memory, it is humanity. And so, the tale of the last meal of history's most powerful emperor continues to fascinate, because in it, we see both the greatness of his life and the humbleness of his end. The man who commanded the world left it as he entered through the simple, universal act of breaking bread. His empire lived on, but his story closed quietly, with a meal, a memory, and a silence that stretched into eternity. The final hours of the emperor's life did not unfold in silence alone. Behind the thick walls of his palace, whispers spread like fire. Servants moved carefully, their eyes lowered, their steps light, as though the weight of history pressed down upon them. Everyone sensed the end was near. It was not only his failing health that created this atmosphere, but also the growing rumors of betrayal. Some believed he would not die naturally. Some believed his last meal would not only be symbolic but fatal. The palace kitchens, once alive with the clattering of pans and the aroma of exotic spices, were quieter that night. The emperor had asked for simplicity, but simplicity did not mean carelessness. Every ingredient for his meal was carefully chosen, every dish tested before being served. And yet, for all the precautions, suspicion filled the air. For an emperor, even in his final hours, enemies lingered in the shadows. A single poisoned cup could erase the last image of dignity and replace it with the horror of treachery. The emperor's most trusted servant, a man who had been with him since his youth, oversaw the preparation. He tasted the bread himself, sipped from the wine before pouring it into the emperor's goblet, and cut small pieces of the roasted meat to test for safety. Yet despite these gestures, some still whispered, could loyalty truly withstand the temptation of power? The empire was vast, its throne priceless. Who would not want to hasten the emperor's end to secure their own rise? The chamber where the emperor dined was lit by oil lamps that cast a golden glow upon the walls. Shadows danced across marble columns and carved wooden panels, making the room appear both grand and lonely. The emperor sat at the head of the table, a figure both majestic and fragile. Once, his presence filled the room, drawing eyes, demanding obedience. Now, his body seemed smaller, his shoulders hunched, his movements slower. Yet even in weakness, his aura of authority remained. Those around him dared not meet his gaze for long. He lifted a piece of bread, broke it with trembling hands, and placed it into his mouth. Such a small gesture, yet it carried centuries of symbolism. Bread had always been the food of life, the staple of empires, the common link between kings and peasants. Some said the emperor chose it deliberately, as though to remind everyone that despite crowns and armies, he too was a man bound by the same needs as the people he ruled. Others saw it as an act of humility, a silent message that he wished to die, not as a godlike ruler, but as a human being. The roasted meat was brought forward, its aroma filling the chamber. It was not the exotic game once hunted for imperial feasts. It was simpler, closer to homeland perhaps, or chicken seasoned with herbs from the palace gardens. Each bite seemed to take the emperor back through time. With one taste, he recalled the great banquets of his youth, when victorious generals filled the hall and music echoed until dawn. With another, he remembered quiet meals with his family, moments of warmth now gone forever. For him, the meat was more than nourishment. It was memory turned into flavor, history turned into taste. The wine was poured, deep red and glistening in the lamplight. The goblet itself was heavy with jewels, but the wine was not the rarest vintage. It was a personal favorite, a drink he had often requested, not for ceremony but for comfort. He raised the cup slowly, his hand shaking slightly, and took a sip. Around the room, a breath was held. Would this be the moment? Would poison reveal itself? But no, he swallowed, sighed softly, and placed the goblet down with care. Whether safe or not, it had been chosen as his companion in this final meal. Beside him sat bowls of fruit, figs, grapes, and dates, sweetness in the face of sorrow. Fruit was more than dessert. To the ancients, figs symbolized fertility and life. Grapes symbolized abundance, and dates symbolized endurance. Placed before him, they became metaphors. Life, abundance, endurance, three things that had defined his reign, yet all slipping away with each passing breath. The emperor picked a grape, rolled it between his fingers, and smiled faintly before eating it. It was as if he acknowledged the irony that the fruit of life could not stop the approach of death. While the emperor ate, the men around him stood stiff, unsure whether to speak. Some were loyal servants, watching with sorrow as their master neared the end. Others were politicians, their minds already calculating what his death would mean for their ambitions. Their silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. Would the empire survive him? Who would sit on the throne next? Would the unity he had built collapse once he was gone? At one moment, the emperor looked up from his meal and locked eyes with a minister who stood nearby. His gaze was sharp, almost accusing, as though he could read the thoughts of betrayal forming in the man's heart. The minister quickly looked away, his face pale. Whether the emperor suspected treachery or simply saw ghosts of the past, no one could tell. But the tension in the room thickened. After a while, the emperor began to speak. His voice was weaker than before, but still steady. He spoke not of armies or conquests, not of riches or palaces, but of regret. He admitted he had been harsh in some decisions, too trusting in others. He confessed that he sometimes wished he had been born an ordinary man, free of the crown's burden. His words shocked those present. To hear the most powerful emperor speak of longing for an ordinary life was both humbling and haunting. Yet he did not dwell on sorrow alone. He also spoke of pride. He spoke of the battles he had won, the lands he had united, the laws he had written. He reminded them that though his body would perish, his empire would endure. He looked at the bread, the wine, the fruit, and declared that these simple things were the true foundations of civilization, not palaces, not armies, but the ability of a people to eat, to drink, to live. It was a moment of clarity, a lesson delivered with his last meal. But as he spoke, his voice began to falter. Fatigue weighed on him. His head drooped slightly. His breaths grew slower. The servants stepped closer, unsure if they should clear the table or let him linger in silence. The emperor pushed the plate away gently, as though signaling that he was finished, not only with the meal, but with the world itself. The room grew colder. Some claimed that the lamps flickered strangely, as if the air itself knew death was near. Others insisted they saw him smile faintly, a final expression of peace, before leaning back in his chair. His hand rested on the table, near the goblet of wine, his eyes half closed, gazing at nothing and everything at once. And then he whispered something so soft that only those closest could hear. Some believed he said, "It is enough." Others swore he named a person, perhaps an heir, or perhaps an enemy. No one could agree, but whatever the words were, they were his last. Not long after, he drew his final breath. The mighty emperor, whose armies had once made the earth tremble, whose commands had changed the course of nations, passed quietly in his chamber, his last memory marked not by war or wealth, but by a simple meal. For the servants, it was a tragedy. For the politicians, it was an opportunity. Within hours, the palace erupted into chaos. Messages were sent across the empire, announcing his death. Ambitious men plotted their next moves. Generals argued about succession, but for those who had been there, who had witnessed his last supper, it was a moment burned forever into memory. The image of him breaking bread, sipping wine, eating fruit, it became legend. Some painted it as a scene of serenity, a ruler accepting his fate with grace. Others twisted it into a tale of poison and betrayal, arguing that the emperor had been silenced, his meal turned into a weapon. The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere in between. What mattered most was not the ingredients of his last meal, but the meaning they carried. It was not a feast of glory, but a supper of reflection. It showed that even emperors, even the most powerful men in history, must face the end, as all humans do, hungry, weary, and mortal. The silence that followed the emperor's final breath lasted only moments, but to those in the room it felt like an eternity. A man who had once commanded nations now sat lifeless in his chair, his hand still resting near the half-finished goblet of wine. For a moment, no one dared to move. The air felt heavy, as though the palace itself was holding its breath. Then, slowly, reality struck, and the room exploded into motion. Servants rushed forward, some weeping, others simply staring at their masters' still face in disbelief. Ministers and courtiers exchanged urgent glances, their minds already spinning. With calculations, outside the chamber, guards whispered the news down dark corridors. By the time the palace bells began to toll, signaling the passing of the emperor, the city itself trembled with uncertainty. But his death did not come as a surprise. Many had been expecting it for weeks. What shocked the empire was not that he had died, but the manner in which he had passed. Whispers spread quickly that his final meal had been poisoned. Some swore they saw his hand tremble unnaturally after drinking the wine. Others claimed he gasped strange words before the end. No two versions of the story were the same, but together they created a firestorm of rumor. Within hours, the palace became a battleground of suspicion. The emperor's most trusted servant, the one who had tasted every dish, was interrogated. Did he fail in his duty, or was he complicit in a plot? The ministers who had stood nearby were questioned relentlessly. Some argued that the emperor's decline was natural, the slow surrender of age. Others insisted his enemies had seized the moment to strike. But who were those enemies? That was the question no one dared answer aloud. The empire had no shortage of rivals. Generals who longed for more power, foreign kings who hated his strength, and even family members who had lived too long in his shadow. Each one had a reason to want him gone, and so the image of his last meal, the bread, the wine, the figs, became a puzzle, a code to be deciphered. Was the bread laced with poison? Was the wine tainted? Or was the fruit merely symbolic of betrayal, sweet on the outside but deadly within? As days turned into weeks, the myths grew. In some versions of the tale, the emperor was said to have been betrayed by his closest advisor, the very man who had sworn eternal loyalty. In others, a foreign queen was blamed, accused of sending a poisoned gift disguised as fruit. Some even claimed the gods themselves had intervened, striking him down at the very moment he tasted his last sip of wine. Meanwhile, the empire began to fracture. Without his steady hand, ministers argued endlessly over succession. Some backed his son, others his brother, while still others supported ambitious generals who believed the throne should be theirs. The uncertainty turned his death into an opportunity. And so, the memory of his last meal was weaponized. One faction claimed he had blessed his son as heir during that final supper, lifting his goblet in a symbolic gesture of succession. Another insisted that he had whispered the name of a general, giving him divine approval to take the crown. Each side told the story differently, twisting the meaning of the emperor's last words to serve their own ambitions. The meal became more than food, it became a political weapon, reshaped to fit every agenda. In the city streets, ordinary people shared their own versions of the story. Some said the emperor had died peacefully, eating humbly like a common man, and that this proved he had been a ruler of the people. Others insisted he had died in agony, his body writhing from poison, a punishment for arrogance. Ballads were sung in taverns, poems were written in marketplaces, each one painting a different picture of that final supper. The emperor's image itself began to change. To some, he was a tragic figure who accepted death with dignity, breaking bread as though breaking the chains of life. To others, he was a victim, betrayed by those closest to him, his meal forever cursed. And to yet another group, he was a tyrant whose end symbolized divine justice, the gods striking him down in the very moment of indulgence. What truly happened at that table? The truth was already lost. The details of the meal, the bread, the meat, the wine, the figs were preserved, but the meaning was forever distorted by the needs of those who retold the tale. And so, the last meal of the most powerful emperor became a mirror in which everyone saw what they wanted: betrayal, tragedy, justice, or humility. Inside the palace, one story persisted among the servants who had been closest to him. They claimed that in those final moments, as he pushed the plate away, he had smiled faintly. They said he looked at the fruit and whispered, not the name of a person, but a single word: life. If true, it meant he had not died in bitterness, but in acceptance, recognizing the fragility of existence. Yet, even this gentle version of the story was drowned out by the louder voices of politics and ambition. The more time passed, the larger the myths grew. Artists painted scenes of his final supper, each one different. In some paintings, the emperor sat tall and regal, lifting a goblet as though toasting eternity. In others, he slumped weakly, surrounded by shadows of betrayers. Some artists even showed him reaching for bread while a hooded figure poured poison into his cup. These images spread across the empire, shaping how generations would remember the event. Historians, too, argued endlessly. Was the emperor murdered, or did he simply succumb to time? Was the meal symbolic, or was it incidental? Was his death a carefully orchestrated assassination, or the quiet surrender of an aging body? Each historian chose their evidence carefully, often guided less by truth and more by the politics of their age. For centuries, the debate continued, and with each retelling, the story of the last meal became more legendary, more mysterious. But one thing was certain: no matter what people believed, no one forgot that meal. The image of bread, wine, and fruit became immortal, etched into history as the symbols of his end. It was not his armies or palaces that lingered most vividly in memory, but the simple act of eating an emperor reduced to the same human ritual. As any peasant, his last moment, not a battle, but a supper. Even his enemies could not deny the power of the image. They mocked his decline, yet they repeated the tale endlessly, ensuring that his final meal remained alive in memory. And perhaps that was the emperor's final victory. Though his body was gone, his story continued. Every retelling, every rumor, every whispered suspicion kept his name alive. He had ensured that in death, he would never truly vanish. And so, the most powerful emperor in history passed not in the clash of swords or the blaze of war, but in the quiet shadows of a chamber. Over bread and wine, his legacy became not just the empire he built, but the meal that ended it. Centuries passed, but the shadow of the emperor's last meal never faded. Kingdoms rose and fell, new rulers claimed his throne, but the story of that bread, that wine, and that final breath remained etched into the memory of the world. What had begun as whispers in a darkened palace chamber became a legend retold in taverns, temples, and royal courts alike. In the decades after his death, each ruler who came to power shaped the story to their own advantage. Some used it to portray him as a victim, a noble figure betrayed by jealous men, a warning to anyone who plotted against authority. Others painted him as arrogant and gluttonous, whose indulgence brought divine punishment. And so the meaning of the last meal changed with every telling, never fixed, always shifting like smoke. Monks in remote monasteries copied manuscripts describing his death. In some of these texts, the emperor's last supper was presented as almost holy, a sacred act that gave him the dignity of a martyr. He was shown lifting the goblet like a priest, blessing his empire one last time before surrendering his soul. But in other writings, he was condemned, accused of overindulgence and greed. His final sip of wine, the act that sealed his downfall. These contradictions did not weaken the story, they made it stronger. Every generation saw what they wanted. In the emperor's final hour, artists across the centuries painted his death in vivid color. Some canvases showed him in candlelit chambers, noble and serene, while others depicted him writhing in agony, clutching his stomach, the poisoned cup spilling beside him. Playwrights wove his last meal into tragedies performed on stage, adding dramatic dialogues he never spoke, but which audiences remembered as if they were real. In one popular play, the emperor stood and declared before collapsing, "Even the mighty are bound by fate." The line was pure invention, but it spread through the world like truth. The people who lived in the lands once ruled by him carried fragments of the story. In their folklore, farmers told their children that the emperor had been punished by the gods for forgetting humility. Merchants swore that the poisoned figs were a metaphor that greed itself would always betray those who sought too much. In the countryside, the meal became a kind of cautionary tale. No matter how high you rise, you must always eat with care, for poison waits where pride dines. And yet, far away from these tales of warning, there were others who remembered him differently. For some, the emperor became a figure of romance and tragedy. His last meal was seen as an intimate moment of humanity, proof that even the greatest of men were not gods, but mortals who ate, drank, and faced death like all others. Lovers whispered the tale under moonlight. Poets compared his final sip of wine to a kiss of eternity, and philosophers debated whether his end was fate or choice. Generations of historians tried to uncover the truth. Was the meal poisoned? Was he betrayed? Or did his body simply surrender to age and time? But the evidence was always uncertain, clouded by myths and rewritten chronicles. The closer they looked, the less certain they became. The mystery only deepened. It was almost as if the emperor himself had ensured that no one would ever know the truth, leaving behind a story that would never die because it could never be solved. In the centuries that followed, rulers across the world looked to the story of the emperor's last meal for inspiration or warning. Some kings dined in fear, tasting every morsel with suspicion, surrounding themselves with food tasters as though the shadow of that final supper still lingered over them. Others deliberately recreated his last meal, eating bread, wine, and figs, as a way of connecting themselves to his legacy. A few even claimed that, by imitating his last act, they would inherit his strength. The meal became more than just food. It became a symbol. To some, it symbolized betrayal, the reminder that even the most trusted companions could be enemies. To others, it symbolized humility, the greatest of men ending his life in the simplest of acts. And to others still, it symbolized mystery itself, the eternal question of what truly happened on that night, a puzzle that would never be solved. Over time, legends grew even stranger. In one version, the goblet he drank from was said to have been hidden away, cursed by the poison that touched it. Knights and treasure hunters searched for it, believing it held the power to reveal secrets of life and death. In another tale, the figs from his plate were carried across seas and planted in foreign lands. The trees that grew from them said to be cursed, bearing fruit that brought sorrow to any who tasted it. These stories may have been superstition, but they spread far and wide, adding to the emperor's mystique. The further his story traveled, the less it belonged to history and the more it belonged to legend. In distant lands where no one even remembered his empire, people still spoke of the emperor who died at supper. His name faded in some places, but the story never did. That, perhaps, was his truest immortality. Not the monuments he built, not the battles he won, but the tale of his final meal. Even in modern times, scholars and storytellers continue to debate his Last Supper. Was it truly poisoned? Was it merely the body of an old man finally surrendering? Was it betrayal, justice, or fate? The mystery continues to captivate minds, for it touches on something deeper than politics or power. It reminds us that death comes for all, and that even the greatest cannot escape the fragile rituals of life, feeding, drinking, and facing the end. And so, the last meal of history's most powerful emperor became eternal. It was remembered not only because of what it was, but because of what it represented. Power and fragility. Betrayal and loyalty. Life and death. It was a story that echoed across time, reshaped by every generation, but never forgotten. Perhaps that was the emperor's final victory. Though his empire crumbled, though his name was debated and twisted, he ensured that his story would never die. And so long as people gather at tables, share bread, sip wine, and wonder at the mysteries of life and death, the memory of his last meal will remain. In the end, the most powerful emperor in history did not need an army to conquer eternity. His legacy lived not in swords or crowns, but in a supper, a single, haunting meal that outlasted everything else.